let us go into break time for just, because the questions were good. And we're not, okay. Yeah, we're gonna have a break now. We'll be back at 9:50. We'll have 2 presentations and then the panel discussion. Okay, our next presenter is Mike Chamberlain, who spent many years as a faculty member at LSU, and more recently has moved to Georgia, but he's come back to talk about some of the things he learned while he was at LSU.
Morning. Morning. Excellent. Very different from a class. What I was asked to do was give a kind of an overview of a bunch of information that I've collected through the years. I say it's primarily graduate students that have collected information on how various species respond to forest management techniques. So what I did was I pulled data sets from 4 studies that were conducted throughout the lower part of the valley and tried to come up with an overview that would interest you guys and would also directly address kind of the debate, if you want to call it that. So what I did was I pulled these 4 data sets and quickly realized that it was way too much to talk about in 20 minutes. So what I did was I started out with some black bear data that's very, very general and broad, and I use it to talk a little bit about scale, and then we're going to work our way down to wild turkeys, which seem to have the most obvious response to the silvicultural techniques that were in place in the study areas that we were working on. Kind of give you a caveat here. I listed these data sets and from a temporal standpoint when they were collected. The black bear data, what I'm showing you stopped in 2007, but actually one of the animals that I'm showing you was collected recently by Joe Clark at the University of Tennessee. In all these studies, we were trying to assess habitat selection of these animals, but the relationship to the silvicultural technique was purely descriptive. We didn't set up any experimental type approaches where we manipulated the environment and then tested how these animals responded. It was merely a description based on the landscape that they had available to them at the time. And the management scenarios were highly variable, as I'll show you, particularly for the black bear data because of how broad their range is. We went everything from the Tensas River Basin, where we were studying black bears, down to the Red River, Three Rivers Wildlife Management Area, kind of about 100,000 acre area there where we were studying black bears. You had all kinds of management from custodial, just we don't do anything to it, to wetland reserve program, easements, to selection harvest that range anywhere from shelter woods to group selection and individual tree cuts. And then the far extreme would be a whitetail deer study that we did in South Louisiana that was entirely patchwork clear cutting. So it kind of ranged from a very intensive tree removal to no management whatsoever. This is a black bear's perspective of what's desirable from a forest perspective. And I hate slides that have a lot of text, but when you're a faculty member, you tell students not to do that, and you turn around and do it anyway. But what I want to point out here is that first bullet. To a black bear scale is what's really relevant. A 5-acre cut or a patch, or these different terms that I've heard this morning, really means very little to a black bear. Scale is what's relevant to an animal that moves as much as that animal does, and I'll show you some examples using some telemetry data. We know that black bears, this third point, these super tree dens, and I'll show you some denning data. Black bears don't den in trees just because they're large enough. These trees are repeatedly used through time, and they're super dens in that they're the largest bald cycles primarily that are available in the landscape, and they repeatedly use them, and they don't use other tree cavities that are seemingly of the same size and quality, at least from our perspective. And the corridor use that I'll show you a little bit of is much more plastic than we thought historically. These animals will use habitats that we theoretically would have been assumed to be unsuitable, such as grassland cover. As long as it hides their back, basically what we found is they would use that. This was a slide I pulled off of a talk that I gave about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was asked to give a really hostile audience in the Tensas River Basin a synopsis of how bear management could be intertwined with deer management. And I came up with this slide, and I still to this day feel very strongly about this. Black bear, anything you do for white-tailed deer, such as mass production, planting cereal grains, providing fawning and browsing cover, all benefits black bears. Again, it's a scale question. For white-tailed deer, you're talking a few 100-acre home range. For black bears, you're talking several thousand or tens of thousands of acres as a home range. So really, it's a scale issue. And I use this little gal, actually a 200-pound gal, to demonstrate this. This is the Lake Ophidia National Wildlife Refuge, and this was a female that was relocated and over a series of several years decided to use most of eastern Louisiana and parts of southwest Mississippi as her home range. And I give you this schematic just to demonstrate that these animals, what occurs right here, or right here, or right over here is really not that relevant for this animal. It's a much broader landscape perspective for black bears. This is what all black bears in the lower part of the valley are dealing with. And what you're seeing here is habitat and not. And that's what they see. They see these patches of forest that are a few hundred acres, a few thousand acres, a few 10, 20,000 acres, and they use what's available to them in various several stages, whether it's very early successional stage, whether it's mature forest, as long as it provides tree cavities, as long as it provides early successional species, soft mass species during the spring, and it contains some type of hard mass in the winter, they're using it. And I want to point out, I'll zoom in on this. These areas, and it's actually good that this was a little bit washed out, this mature forest, quote unquote, versus this regeneration area, at this scale, you can barely see the difference between it. And that's what I want to highlight with this slide. You zoom in on that, and what you see is that black bears, although they're not indiscriminate, they're plastic in their habitat use. So what you're seeing here is all these locations. This was 6 months of locations on this female, and what you see is it's kind of a wash that she's using these mature forest areas that are here. She's using these tree regeneration sites, these cuts. What we ended up finding with most of these bears is that there's a strong seasonal bias here, that from mid-spring when they exit their den, which is right now, until about June, these animals are primarily using some type of canopied forest, whether it's 90% or 70%, again, is not particularly relevant to them. They're using these areas, they're foraging on beetles, they're eating succulent green grass, and then all of a sudden they start this travel, which is very, very common in southeastern black bears, where they are now starting to access more early successional plant communities. They're accessing soft mass, and particularly in the lower part of the valley, they're bouncing around from these crop fields, presumably kind of selecting and testing these crop fields to see when they're going to be ripe, and then they're starting to consume corn, milo in those fields. The point being here is that the successional trajectory of the stand is not particularly relevant in a small scale for a black bear. It's much broader. I get this question a lot, and I know this debate is not about CRP or WRP, but I put this slide in here to make a point that from a bear's perspective, there is a difference between a wetland reserve program easement and a clear cut or a shelter wood cut or a selection cut of some kind. And the difference is that these easements start out as herbaceous plant communities, and then they succeed slowly into a woody plant community. That is not what we're finding. That is not bear habitat initially. It takes quite a few number of years for those animals to start accessing those easements and actually benefiting from the resources that it provides. Early on, it's primarily denning cover, and then it takes a number of years for it to start producing mass and cover. On the other hand, when you're harvesting timber, you go from a woody plant community to another woody plant community, and they use those systems almost immediately after the harvest occurs. when I say like big dens, super dens, this is what I'm talking about. These trees are extremely large. Hydrology is important. If you look, there's a wide body of literature on denning ecology of black bears in the southeast. A lot of it was collected at Mississippi State. Some's been collected at LSU. And basically what it shows is if you have tree dens that are large bald cypress, black bears use them. If you don't have those tree dens and you put logging debris on topographically higher areas, they use that. So the bottom line is the denning ecology of this animal is plastic enough that they're compatible with timber harvest, whether it's a patch type, as we heard earlier, whether it's patches an acre, 10 or 20 acres, again, they're going to react to that in a way given their generalist nature, which we know. If you look at the size, I hate metric, I'm metrically challenged, but I left this here to demonstrate that this is big, right? So 219 centimeter DBH on these tree dens, this was an average. So these are large cypress trees, and what we found is these animals are repeatedly using the same den year after year after year, with an adjacent den tree that looks very similar not being used year after year after year, even though we're checking all of these den trees. The point being that during the planning of forest harvesting, these trees are critically important to this animal if they're already on site. So that's kind of the take home. And bottom line is most of them are in bald cypress. Then you kind of move down to a smaller scale here with an animal that's very plastic, a white-tailed deer. No offense to Steve, but deer, Dr. Leopold once referenced them as pine goats. Well, in this case, they're bottomland goats. They're very, very plastic in their behavior, and they'll use a variety of different habitat types. What I want to move into this to show you that we go from a very large scale, basically the entire valley is bear habitat for certain individuals because they move so much. Now you're moving into a system where the forest management was a 40-acre patchwork clear cut, and this was in South Louisiana. And the scale issue here is these are the smallest reported home ranges for white-tailed deer ever in the literature. So these animals that are living around these clear cuts or maintaining the smallest home ranges that's ever been reported, and to this day is still the smallest home ranges. And for a 3 or 4 year old male, you're talking on the order of 150 acres, which is about 25% or less of what you would expect. So these animals are maintaining very, very small home ranges. And what we observed in this study was that their behavior was closely tied to these patchwork clear cuts. And if you kind of look here, keep an eye on these same clear cuts are going to show up for multiple animals. So in essence, what's happening here is these are nighttime locations and these are daytime locations. So as we're monitoring these deer, they're using these clear cut areas during the first, second, third, fourth growing season afterwards as foraging, and then ultimately as cover. And then they're escaping into the mature forest that's adjacent to it primarily during the day. Here's two animals. You'll see these are the same clear cuts that were in the previous picture. And what we observed here, we didn't expect, but basically what you're doing is you're stacking multiple mature individuals on the same piece of land. And if you pick up literature on white-tailed deer, you wouldn't expect to see this type of density of mature deer on such a small area, a few hundred acres. And these were two of the largest home ranges that we had in the study with less than 400 acres. I want to point out these core area sizes because 25 acres, this is where the animal spent most of its time. So basically this animal spent 50% of its time in 25 acres, which is extremely small if you pick up literature on white-tailed deer. And when we published this data, we directly stated in the manuscript that we felt very certain that this type of spatial arrangement among these adult males was a consequence of the habitat characteristics associated with that forest management strategy. Then we looked at it from a female standpoint, and the female home ranges were so small that some of them didn't even have access to a clear cut, even though these are patchwork type harvest. And in those situations, these forest openings became extremely important, rights of way, food plots, that type of thing. So I use this kind of to illustrate that you're going, now for females, you're talking about 11 acres. So basically just this area around this building and some of these parking lots, in essence, served as her bedroom, foraging area for throughout the almost 2 years that we monitored that particular female. Okay, and we'll shift gears a little bit and go to an animal that uses anything. If you watch the Great Outdoors with John Candy and Dan Aykroyd, has anybody seen that? It's a classic movie. Okay, the raccoons with the articulate little fingers, and they open the trash, and he throws up the steak okay, you get it. Raccoons will use whatever habitat they have available to them. There's raccoons on barrier islands, there's raccoons on the Outer Banks of North Carolina that are eating sea turtle nests. If you have habitat, they'll use it. So in this respect, they're a pretty good species to look at, because if they behaviorally respond to a management scenario, you should expect that the change to the environment is relatively drastic if this animal is going to react to it. So the data I'm going to show you here are collected on the same pieces of space that the turkey data are collected on, which is the last animal we'll talk about. This is raccoon habitat in a bottomland forest. This is a lowland type, elm ash, sugarberry, growing around here with these ephemeral type pools that you have lots and lots of invertebrate biomass that's there. And the difference between this and an upland forest may only be a few inches on this study area, yet these animals consistently selected this type of habitat. You go there, you see all kinds of signs where they're foraging. There's what they're eating. And this is a spring, summer type phenomenon, but yet they continue to use these forest types. What I want you to notice, if you kind of think back to some of the earlier information you got about patch, to a raccoon, what we ended up figuring out is a patch could literally be this stage. That's a patch to a raccoon, and they may have spent hours foraging in the size of this room within these forests, and then they would go back to sleep for the night. So a patch to a raccoon is less than an acre in many respects. This is to show you, and I'll come back to these areas because they were important in our study. This is a series of early successional plant communities that were managed for woodcock, for wintering woodcock. And the management in place when I first moved to Louisiana in 2000 was these were succeeding into trees and were being managed with prescribed fire. And then as these stands succeeded, they're now pole stands in essence. And what we saw was, as we expected, raccoons couldn't have cared less. If the stand was there, they used it and they foraged within it. And what we ended up finding, which we expected, is these animals are strongly territorial, and their spacing is dictated by things other than what this stand looks like versus this stand. That they're in essence they're stuck on the landscape in a system that's a function of their territoriality and their inability to get along with each other, in other words. So it's much less relevant what the habitat structure is, but what I want to point out here is these are two animals of the same sex. This is two males, and what you see here is basically that this one particular male in this early successional disturbed forest maintains a very, very small home range and forages in the same area repeatedly night after night after night, whereas this particular animal primarily is living in kind of this mature forest and then goes into that same forest. So he ended up foraging over a much greater area relative to his buddy. This area right here was managed through a variety of selection cuts. And when I say selection cuts, I mean the trees were cut, they're gone. So if I took a student from a wildlife habitat management class out there, he or she would probably say that looks like a clear cut. And that's what it was. It was a small clear cut. And if you move to a different stand, they may say, oh, that's a little bit bigger clear cut. The bottom line is most of the trees were gone in these harvests. These animals were immediately attracted to those systems. So what we saw, how many times did I have? 5 or 2?
You're too old.
Too old? Wow, okay. 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 What you see here is basically these animals are using that those cuts, okay? The wild turkeys, this is a couple brief slides and we'll go through it. The bottom line is turkeys do not. They didn't use any of these harvests. They didn't use clear cuts, they didn't use shelterwood cuts, they didn't use group selection cuts. In fact, as I'll show you very quickly, their home ranges, even if they overlap them, they never stepped foot inside these stands. They would use the edges, but they wouldn't use the stand. And what we did is, these numbers right here are what turkeys nested in based on about 70 birds. So the bottom line is most of these birds were nesting in a certain patch size within a certain distance of an edge, and the forced openings were relatively critical. And by forced openings, I don't mean a clear cut or a shelterwood cut. It was a food plot or something that was maintained. The stuff in white is where turkeys nested. And I want to draw your attention to right here. This is a shelterwood cut, and these dark areas are kind of lowland type forests that are wet, okay? And then right down here is where those two last raccoons were using. And what you notice is, bottom line is these more extensive harvests where you have more trees being removed were not nesting habitat for birds, nor was it brooding cover. This is the shelterwood cut, and that's white is the same white nesting area that was in the previous slide. Basically, what you're seeing here is that these animals are avoiding, structurally it's not even nesting cover for these birds. This is the raccoon area that I showed you from the selection harvest, and the bottom line is the model basically excludes those harvests from being nesting cover, and it's primarily because they succeed so rapidly. These are the woodcock fields, and in essence showing that these pole stands are also not nesting or brooding cover. So now I'm over by how much? I'll quit. But the take home is, which you can see yourself, is really the scale is more relevant for a farm animal. Turkeys were really the only critter that showed a very strong selection or not thereof to the silvicultural techniques that are on the landscape. Any questions?
I have a question. That last statement, successional trajectory is an important determinant.
Yep.
What about the successional trajectory is important to turkeys?
For turkeys, what I mean by that statement is these sites that are disturbed that succeed very, very rapidly, the first growing season, in essence, on the group selection cuts, some of the silvicultural, the shelterwood cuts, it looks like habitat. When you walk out there, it looks like nesting cover during the first growing season. After the first growing season, the next 7 or 8 or 10 or 11 or 12 years, depending on the site, is no habitat. At some point, it's going to return to habitat, but during that initial decade, it's zero habitat for that bird.
But you're not saying a specific species composition is...
No. And all I'm basing this on for turkeys is basically the structure, not the force composition. It's just from a structure standpoint. Because we were primarily looking at nesting ecology and stuff. Any other questions? Thanks.
Here, our last presentation is by, I guess you go by Buddy? Yes. Buddy Dupuy, with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries.
Yesterday, I referred to hackberries, and Brian had to correct me, called them school berries. So I reminded him after the talk that a professor of mine had once told me, if you say ain't, it's okay if you know better. So I'm going to say hackberry and bitter pecan as much as I want. Part of the mission of the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries is to provide recreational opportunities to the public. In our hunt regulation pamphlet, we have 53 WMAs, total 1.3 million acres. We own all of Florida, 37 of those, 33 in the Forest Management Program. I'm going to talk fast because I've got a lot of stuff. Some of those in the program were inoperable too swampy, we don't really do any harvest there. So we have 28 areas that we do a considerable amount of activity on. 319,000 of that is, about 95% is bottomland hardwood. Most of that is going to be the northern half of the Mississippi Valley, the orange and the red. Also down here in Sherburne, Pearl River, and in the Red River Valley. To give you a snapshot of what kind of timber we're looking at, is sugarberry elm ash, a lot of overcup, bit of pecan, and as you can see, but the remaining 25% is probably dispersed between most of the remaining bottomland cover types. A little closer look. These are the 4 most common species on what I call the Big Six. These big 6 areas, it's 225,000 acres. For those that can't see the bottom, that's 2/3 of the bottomland we're talking about. This is nut all oak, overcup oak, willow oak, bit of pecan. Overcup or nut all are in the top 2 on all of those. Give you some idea. That's the bigger trees. Just for curiosity point, I put in a little bit of data on the 4 to 11 inch trees. On Dewey and willows, now look at the old story, Dewey and sage, they're nearly identical until you look at the red oak component. Just a point of interest, we might talk more about that later. This is operational management, not a study. Scattered all over the valley. Objective is simple. We'll expand on that in a minute. Methods is forest management. And we've been doing this since 1967. We've got 369 compartments. They average about 1,000 acres apiece. These are 5-year increments. Kenny may have misspoken a little yesterday when he said there was only a couple of sales preceding them. There are a few more. Kenny started right here. And you can see what happened afterwards. And Kenny left about right here. Yeah, we treated 53,000 acres and 154 individual sales over the last 46 years. The objectives: enhance the habitat conditions to meet the ecological needs of priority wildlife. And the other, it's not objective, but it's a focus, is to maintain quality forest products and the future sustainability so that we can continue to treat that habitat through forest management. We kind of beat this one to death, but what we're trying to, it's important at the scale level, the landscape level, and also at the site level. What we're trying to do is create diversity, structural diversity, in terms of tree species, size classes, growth forms, like heterogeneous canopy with gaps and complex layering. This is pretty, and it's good for some things, but it's not what we're really after. We want to retain some of it, certainly. Again, a deer would have to pack a suitcase to find lunch. This is what we like on part of the area, complex layering. This is dormant season. It's another area where you see a overstory and a little bit of somewhat of a gap right here. We've gone over this one quite a bit already, so we won't spend any time on that. Secondary management factors. What you do, and I mean when I'm saying that, I'm talking about when you have your paint done and you're out there applying the treatment on the ground, is depending upon what you have to start with and what your objectives are. We've talked about the objectives enough. But the starting point is always different. Every stand we go to has been cut at some point in time. Hydrology has been changed, you reach swell topography. So we're looking at species diversity may be high, maybe low, maybe the site's changed and what you have is not appropriate anymore or not performing well. Stocking can be high, low, moderate, and it's variable throughout the stand. We may be talking about big stems, we may be talking about poles. Regeneration, maybe you got it, maybe you don't, maybe it's competitive, maybe it's not. if it's the right species, you got harvest limitations. You know, some stands are on the side of the gravel road, most of them are not. And that makes a difference on what you can and can't do in that stand. The techniques we've used over time, individual tree selection, and this comes from prescription. This wordage is not completely indicative on the individual selection. That's thin. That also had some groups in it. And yes, we've used it 77 times. These totals down here, that's 200 something, it adds up to more than the timber sales, because some sales had multiple types of treatments. If we used clear cut and had 4 clear cut units in that sale, I counted that as one time. Once we made the decision that clear cut was what we needed to do on that stand to meet the objectives. Back in the day, they used species harvest. Leave those, cut the junk. That was wildlife harvest. It ain't like that anymore. These 5 total up to about 40,000 acres. Those types of treatments, you put your eyeballs on every individual tree. Pretty intensive, but individual selection doesn't necessarily mean taking an individual tree. It means looking at them one at a time and deciding whether or not you want to take that tree. Just a snapshot of where we've been. This is one of the older areas. A lot of species cut. I lump the colors for a group and for individual group together because they're really similar. Just a matter of how many groups you put in, which one you call it. We've been around a lot of these areas, but there's still a lot of ground we haven't touched. Some of it is really, it's low and marginal and not really optimal. Three Rivers, a lot of riverfront hardwoods on that one. The decision-making process. Anytime we enter a department, we write a prescription, brief management plan, describe the area, location, boundaries, and so forth, and then spell out the objectives a little more clearly. Each prescription may have specific objectives to it, not just a broad objective to enhance habitats. We'll identify the methods, whether we're going to use single tree or group or clear cut. Notice any specific concerns, as any unique components to this stand that you don't find anywhere else on the WMA. Is there a natural area nearby? Just the only high and dry spots for turkeys to nest, and so forth. We got listed here the big 6 plus the next big 4. So that's the big 10. These are the 4 next biggest areas with the most activity. Just randomly grab a prescription from the last 10 years from each one of these. Give you an idea what kind of objectives we spell out. Can everybody read all the way down to the bottom? Pretty good. Basically, increasing browsing cover most every time. Sometimes you don't have to spell it out, it's implied. You improve the rigor, residual growth, and the growth of residual trees, not so in the clear cut, obviously. Structural diversity is an objective nearly every time. Sometimes we're trying to establish regeneration, sometimes we're releasing what we have. Sometimes turkeys are considered, sometimes they're not on the area. Releasing tree species, increasing species diversity. Well, we're not adding trees, but if we have a more diverse regeneration component in the old story, we need different types of cuts to make it more diverse sooner. So how do we choose which of these techniques we're going to use? Well, if it's a well-stocked stand, relatively uniform, just probably doing a thin, just a crown stand, kind of an intermediate cut. Well, it is an intermediate harvest, but there's no final harvest. It's good quality, multiple species, relatively young, just a thinning. If the quality is poor, species diversity is low, getting older, you may be thinking maybe thin and heavier. They be trying explicitly to establish regeneration. this harvest is not over, but that's a residual tree, that's a leaf tree, leaf tree, leaf tree. That one back here. Individual and group, that's when we know we're gonna put in a higher percentage of groups, and the groups are either to release reproduction or just to make small groups for early succession stuff. Where the quality's good, you're going to have, it's not going to be uniform across the stand. You will have areas of good quality stocking, and then you'll get into areas where it's poor quality or stocking. If you got a regeneration there, you're making more groups. So you're in and out of both approaches. You're doing general light thinning, and then you whacking it. If the overstory is manageable, but you have some residual red oak from a 15-year-old cut, and you don't have much opportunity to get it again, it's not, you may go ahead and prematurely cut some of your nicer stuff, hoping to move up some of that red oak. It may or may not perform for you if it's too old and flat top, but you take that opportunity to try it. If the overstory diversity is low, the regeneration, if the species diversity is low, but your reproduction is more diverse, you're making more groups, but you're trying to get a more diverse stand quicker. These guys walk through a group and they go into another one in the background, and it's the in between the groups. Another shot of a group. It's hard to get a good shot of a big group and the thin at the same time. Just straight up group selection, well, maybe the conditions are good and you really don't want to do much, or you don't want to thin across the whole stand, but you want some patches of early successional habitat, or releasing regeneration. Yes, that's a small group, but that's some short trees around the outside of it also. And we'll probably talk about that in the discussion later, but group size, it really depends on not only the height of your trees, but the species of them. Bitter pecans and overcups are going to let more light through than water oak. And if you've already thinned around the group, it doesn't have to be as big as if you hadn't. Another group. Shelton wood, we use it in the classic sense to move up regeneration. We'll also use it to release reproduction that's already there. And we may just leave the old wood indefinitely, either to have a 2-age stem, multiple layers, or just to retain certain desirable components, snags, cavities, or if there's rare mass producers in there, we'll leave them in the old wood indefinitely. Maybe species like cottonwoods that's not coming back, we will leave those. On the clear cuts, sometimes we do biological clear cut where we have the loggers mow down everything. Sometimes it's not necessary. Most of it gets knocked down anyway. If you cut down, if they harvest it down to 4 inches or 6 inches rather, there's not much left. Maybe you didn't have much to start with, so. But we don't always require them to mow. Merchantable clear cut. Well, it's obvious what it is, but sometimes the overstory may be sparse enough and your reproduction is so dense and advanced that the logging damage it's almost a good thing. If you had plenty of overstory and they went and got it all, they destroyed the advanced reproduction or set it way back. But when you got 2 to 6 inch advanced reproduction, 30 feet tall, and the overstory running 20 trees to the acre, you can go take the overstory and pre-commercially thin that reproduction. We don't use it often, but there are situations when that happens. So the point is, you do all kinds of different things based on the conditions where you are at that time. This was, it was actually not quite immersible clear cut, it's predominantly like 90% bitter pecan. We had a few overcuts. And some of the advanced reproduction was 8 inches, it was merchant, but most of it was smaller. We basically took 90% of the merchantable volume by taking out the bitter pecan, and we released a much more complex understory. There were lots of overcut saplings and ash, sugarberry. And in this stand, there were red oaks that were coming in and advancing on their own. There's not a mama tree within a mile of this. I've been across a few thousand acres on Classic Lake, never seen a red oak over 18 inches. But within a mile, there are some, and somehow they got there. I don't really subscribe to the fact that they were all cut out. I think there's always going to be some missed if people were targeting them. Or there's been some calls that they had left. The underlying philosophy is leave the best, cut the worst, only sometimes. We make concessions to that. And that's probably where wildlife forestry differs from production forestry. It's the percentage of time that you're willing to make these concessions and cut your preferred and leave your cutting stock. We don't inventory by this, but when you walk through the stand looking at a tree subconsciously, first thing you're thinking about is whether that tree can make a salt timber down the road. Then you decide whether or not you're going to use one of the exceptions to that rule. Cutting stock, any tree that we're going to feel like we're losing in the next cutting cycle, be it salt timber or pulp, probably should go, but they won't all go. Or if the tree does not have any potential for saw log in the future, it's too crooked, too far, first thing in your mind is, I'm probably going to cut that tree. These are the exceptions. If the preferred tree falls within a group that you're trying to release reproduction, but you take it out. If you've got better trees between it, we don't leave every preferred just because it's preferred. Sometimes we'll stand between two preferred. Or if we're trying to take, if it's a preferred tree, preferred ash overtopping a hackberry with vines, and I haven't seen a hackberry in the last 40 minutes at work, I may cut that match. But if it happens regularly, I certainly won't go release every crooked tree. When do we cut or leave our cutting stock? It's a species of high importance, but relatively low occurrence. Or check the base of a leaf tree, logging damage. Or of a miniature natural area. We don't cover every acre. When we walk through a 300-acre cell, you won't see blue dots on every acre. Sometimes you'll find what we call mini natural areas. Things are good like they are, or unique, and we just walk around. Just keep going. So we're going to leave there. No cut zone. The active cavities certainly don't leave every one, but if it's an obvious one that looks active, looks good, we'll leave it. And certainly if it's an intermediate tree or not impeding any of the better growing stock, we go ahead and leave it. Vines present in the stand, otherwise short on vines, that doesn't happen too often. Usually we're pretty good on vines. Dying trees are going to stay in the stand a lot longer than a dead tree. And we don't leave every dying tree. If volume is an issue for yourself, and a lot of times it is, you may have to get most of those overstressed trees and dying trees, knowing that the compartment right next to you has got plenty of them, depending on where you are. Obviously, a cavity tree is a high-risk tree for wind throw. We may leave something adjacent to it, whatever it is, protect it, and need shade. Well, a lot of times in a lot of our stands, if you cut every cutting stock tree, you cut pretty darn hard. And if you didn't have reproduction on the ground, that's probably not too good. So we may just leave it in place, cut some of them, leave some of them. And just for the aesthetics, unique situations. Now, I would never go cut that hackberry, even though it's a cutting stock tree. You know, some squirrel hunter's going to say, well, that's pretty neat, even if he stops for a few seconds. This a residual bell cypress in a stand that's otherwise poles, young. We may leave it half acre, quarter acre, fifth acre. It's got vines, the cavities, obviously, the den. We just leave it alone. A bare den tree, obviously not going to cut that. Sometimes leaners are important because we've got a lot of water in some of our areas, and a little bit of mound in the base of the leaner tree can be a sanctuary, at least for a short time during high waters. Well, it actually had some dewberries growing on it. And the small cavity, that's probably an overtop tree, weak intermediate at best. If it didn't need volume for that stand, for that sail, just leave it. We're good? We're short? Okay. I just want to put some of this out there to show you we are monitoring growth over time. This is 29 fifth-acre plots, about 1 per 1,000 acres, a little bit more in Red River actually. They're CFI plots. So it's a small sample size, but they're permanent plots. And back in 2000, this is what it looked like, and in 2010, that's what it looked like. Well, yeah, sugarberries have shade-tolerant trees are a lot more abundant now. That's not necessarily bad. You remember what the old store looked like on Red River at the beginning. Plus, this would have happened with or without the cut. The hydrology on Red River is altered. There's a pumping system, doesn't flood like it used to. So that's happening anyway. Russell sage. Yeah, the sugarberry's going up a little bit. Willow, more or less stable. We'll contrast that with dewy willows. Russell sage has experienced some oak decline, so some of the loss in red oak is a function of that. Dewy willows has a lot of oak decline. It has happened around 2000. Apparently, a lot of those trees were still in, but you don't see that big a drop between. Let's look at the 15-inch trees. Not that big a drop, but if you go back now, when we reread, we expect to find a lot less. Plus the cutting history. We've done more cutting since the original readings. But look at the willow that's in there now. 31 of them under 15 inches. The site has changed. They're coming in on their own. Now part of it may be because of the cattle that were run through there 30 years ago. Maybe it helped establish them. But they're coming on by themselves through the old cup and bitter pecan. And in summary, we're trying to provide that diverse structure. We use silvicultural treatments to do that. We identify and retain key habitat components when deficient, and don't get carried away with it. And we recognize that the future value of that stand is what's going to dictate our future silvicultural options.
Yeah, we'll take some questions.
Buddy, two quick questions. Did y'all use any vegetation control in management? And the oak decline you mentioned, is that the disease syndrome or is that something else you're talking about?
Vegetation management, not so much. We've done some, quite a bit of talatry injection, but we don't do injection with elm, sugarberry. A lot of times they don't have a red oak story to be regenerated. Some of them. Where we have plenty of water oak, and we have areas with plenty of water oak, buckhorn and bone and tear and Sherman. We don't really have too much problem regenerating water oak. What was the?
Oak decline.
Oak decline,
Disease
okay.
syndrome?
I'm not sure specifically, but it was a series of things. There was a canal dug through the area back in the 60s, 70s, which severely changed the hydrology of dewy willows, and we had a pretty severe 2 or 3 year dry period, 99, 2000, 2001, I think it was. And that's when it really started showing up. A lot of mortality, and then when the trees got weak, got a lot of red oak borers in there. So we had to dry condition the red oak borers. And on the salvage sales, we would, the trees were at such varying degrees of degrade, it was hard to tell what was merciful, but we painted the best of the best, most living, vigorous trees for attention. And the salvage artist would go ahead and take what you can utilize. And some of those sales, within a few years, what we had painted, heat is also dead.
Any questions?